In the bruised aftermath of a storm that had clawed its way across the savannah, an extraordinary silence descended, heavy and watchful. The air, usually vibrant with the calls of unseen birds and the distant hum of insect life, was now muted, thick with the scent of wet earth and broken foliage. It was in this charged stillness, under a sky slowly clearing to a tender, rain-washed blue, that something truly remarkable was unfolding, an event that would ripple through the very fabric of the reserve, whispered about for years to come. Before we dive into this incredible account of survival and unexpected tenderness, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe that kindness, in its myriad forms, exists even in the raw heart of the wild, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that reveal the astonishing depths of the natural world. The core of the unfolding drama lay near a cluster of shattered acacia trees, their branches strewn like broken bones upon the sodden ground. There, a colossal figure was sprawled, unmoving. He was a monarch of this domain, a magnificent male lion, his mane the color of sun-scorched grass, now matted with mud and darkened by rain. He was vast, a creature of immense power, yet he lay with a stillness that spoke of utter defeat, his great flanks barely rising with the shallowest of breaths. Life clung to him by a thread, frayed and worn thin by the tempest's fury and whatever brutal encounter had brought him so low. But it wasn't just his fallen state that held the eye, it was the small, improbable figures gathered around him. Cubs. Not one, but three, their coats still bearing the mottled spots of infancy, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of his immense, prone form. They should have been with their mother, sheltered and safe. Instead, they were here, in the shadow of a fallen giant, their presence a question mark against the harsh logic of the wild. The silence held, pregnant with unspoken possibilities, but something was about to shift, a subtle current of change in that profound quiet, an act that would redefine the boundaries of instinct and compassion. Ranger David Shage knew this stretch of the Masai Mara intimately. Every rise and dip in the land, every game trail that snaked through the tall grasses, was etched into his memory. He'd seen the raw beauty and the brutal realities of this ecosystem play out countless times, but the scene that slowly came into focus through his binoculars that morning sent a jolt through his seasoned composure. He'd been tracking the aftermath of the storm, a violent squall that had torn through the reserve the previous night, its thunderous rage echoing for hours. The reports were already coming in. Flash floods in the lower plains, trees uprooted, and undoubtedly casualties among the wildlife. The male lion was one he recognized, a formidable patriarch known for his size and the deep, resonant power of his roar that often rolled across the plains at dawn. To see him like this, downed, vulnerable, seemingly on the brink of death, was a somber sight. His vast body was unnaturally still, save for the faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his ribs. One massive paw was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, wet patch stained the fur along his flank, though whether it was mud or blood, David couldn't yet tell from this distance. The air around the fallen lion was thick with the metallic scent of churned earth and something else, something that pricked at David's senses, the faint, underlying odor of distress. But it was the cubs who truly seized his attention, holding it captive. They were young, perhaps only a few months old, small enough to be incredibly vulnerable. He scanned the surroundings intently for a lioness, their mother, but the plains were empty save for the distant, unconcerned grazing of a herd of wildebeest and the ominous, patient circling of vultures high above, their dark shapes like punctuation marks against the clearing sky. A low, guttural growl, carried on the damp breeze from a thicket some way off, might have been a hyena, already scenting opportunity. This was the first subtle whisper of the dangers that were now closing in. The region, a sprawling expanse of acacia woodland and open grassland, was typically teeming with life. Now, it bore the fresh scars of the storm. Pools of muddy water collected in depressions, the grasses were flattened in wide swathes, and the air, usually dry and dusty, was heavy with moisture. The ground itself was treacherous, a slick, cloying mud that would make movement difficult for any creature, let alone one injured or weakened. David knew that if the big male couldn't rise, he wouldn't last long. Exposure, or the scavengers that were an inevitable part of this landscape, would claim him. He watched, his heart heavy, as one of the cubs, bolder than its siblings, took a tentative step towards the massive, motionless head of the lion. It was so small, its spotted fur still fluffy, its movements imbued with the clumsy curiosity of youth. The cub sniffed the air, then lowered its head, nudging the unresponsive muzzle of the fallen king. There was no reaction. The cub let out a tiny, questioning mewl, a sound so fragile it seemed to dissolve into the vastness of the plains. David felt a familiar conflict stir within him, the ingrained protocol of non-intervention versus the deep, human urge to help. But to approach now, with the cubs so close and the lion's condition unknown, could precipitate a worse crisis. He could spook the cubs, scatter them, or worse, provoke a reaction from the injured male if he had any fight left in him. For now, all he could do was observe, his gaze fixed on the unfolding, silent drama. The cubs were far too close to the fallen adult, an adult who, if he were from a rival pride or simply disoriented by pain, could lash out. Something was profoundly unusual, and the first tendrils of a deep unease, mixed with a nascent sense of awe, began to coil within him. The catalyst for the day's extraordinary events had been the storm itself. It had descended with terrifying speed, a black wall of wind and rain that had sent animals scrambling for shelter. The old lion, perhaps caught in a territorial dispute or already nursing a minor injury, had been exposed. The sheer force of the deluge, the crashing thunder that vibrated through the ground, and the disorienting chaos had likely led to his fall, perhaps a slip on muddy ground, a collision with a falling branch, or an escalation of a fight that turned desperate in the blinding conditions. Now, as David watched, his breath held, the cubs began to move with a strange, shared purpose. They had likely been separated from their mother during the storm's fury, their small calls for her lost in the roar of the elements. Driven by fear and disorientation, they had stumbled upon this still, warm bulk. Perhaps it was the sheer size of the fallen male that offered a deceptive sense of security, or perhaps a deeper, more primal instinct was at play. One cub, then another, hesitantly approached the lion. They sniffed along his flank, their small noses twitching. The largest of the three, perhaps driven by a need for comfort, tried to nestle against the thick fur of his side, but the lion remained inert. David saw a faint tremor run through the old warrior's frame, a shallow, ragged breath that was more a sigh of profound exhaustion than a sign of revival. The cub that had first nudged his head now tried again, more insistently this time, pushing its small face against his cheek. It was a gesture of profound innocence, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the lion's condition. From his vantage point, David could see the darkening stain on the lion's side more clearly now. It was indeed blood, though the rain had washed much of it away, leaving a diluted smear. The angle of his leg was definitely wrong. A fracture seemed likely. He made a quick note, his mind cataloging the injuries, the environmental factors, the presence of the cubs. The vultures were slowly descending, their circles tightening. A lone hyena, emboldened, had emerged from the distant thicket and was now visible at the edge of the clearing, its head low, testing the air, its yellow eyes fixed on the scene. This was the first true test. If the lion couldn't rouse himself, or if no other protection was offered, the hyena would not remain hesitant for long. David kept his vehicle's engine off, knowing the sound could alter the delicate balance. He was a ghost in the landscape, a silent witness. The afternoon sun, now fully emerged, began to beat down, and the steam rising from the wet ground created a hazy, dreamlike quality to the scene. The heat would soon become another adversary for the fallen lion, dehydrating him, weakening him further. The cubs, too, were exposed. David watched, his tension coiling tighter with every passing minute. The smallest cub, looking lost and forlorn, let out a series underscore of soft, plaintive mews. It was the sound of utter vulnerability. Then, the dynamic shifted subtly. The cubs, instead of scattering or wandering off, began to cluster more deliberately around the injured male. One nudged his mane, its tiny claws snagging briefly in the thick tangles. Another began to lick, with a small, raspy tongue, at the edge of the wound on his flank, a behavior that could be interpreted as investigative or, incredibly, a primitive attempt at cleaning. It was impossible to know their intent, but their actions were undeniable. They stayed. The sun climbed higher, baking the plains. The air grew thick and heavy. David could see the lion's breathing becoming more labored, his great chest heaving with the effort. Flies began to gather, drawn by the scent of blood and stillness. The vultures landed in the nearby acacias, their bald heads craning, their beady eyes patient. The hyena had been joined by another, and they now paced at a safer distance, but their presence was a constant, looming threat. David noted every detail, his camera clicking softly, documenting what he was seeing. He saw the cubs begin to pant, their small bodies struggling with the heat. One of them, the one that had been licking the wound, now slumped against the lion's side, seeking shade from his bulk. The others followed suit, pressing themselves against the vast, unmoving form. It was an extraordinary tableau, the fallen king, surrounded by these tiny, spotted creatures, who seemed to be drawing comfort from him even as he lay perilously close to death. Suddenly, the hyena that had been bolder made a darting advance, a quick, opportunistic move to test the situation. It came within 20 yards, then paused, its ugly head lowered. One of the cubs, startled by the sudden movement, scrambled to its feet and let out a surprisingly fierce, albeit tiny, hiss. It was a comical sound, yet delivered with such conviction that the hyena momentarily checked its advance. The other cub shuffled even closer to the lion, forming a small, almost unconscious barrier. The hyena, perhaps unsure of the situation, or wary of the sheer size of the adult lion even in his prone state, retreated a few paces, whining its frustration. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cubs, in their innocence, in their instinctive clustering, had inadvertently provided a fragile, momentary defense. A wave of despair washed over David. It seemed hopeless. The lion was too badly injured, the scavengers too persistent, the cubs too vulnerable. He reached for his radio, his finger hovering over the call button to alert the veterinary team. Intervention was fraught with risks. Darting the lion in his current state could be fatal, and separating the cubs from him now felt like disrupting something sacred, something he didn't fully understand. As he hesitated, he saw the lion's ear twitch, a minuscule movement, but a definite one. Then, a low groan rumbled from deep within the massive chest, a sound of immense pain, but also of life. The smallest cub, the one that had been mewling earlier, had somehow managed to wriggle its way under the lion's great chin, snuggling into the thick fur of his throat. It lay there, a tiny, warm presence against the pulse of the dying king. And then, the lion's eyes, which had been closed against the pain and the harsh light, flickered. Just a flicker, but it was there. His gaze, unfocused and dull, seemed to rest for a moment on the small creature nestled against him. This was the turning point, the moment when the narrative of despair began to pivot towards an almost unbelievable hope. The lion's eyes flickered again, then slowly, laboriously, opened a fraction more. They were cloudy with pain and exhaustion, but there was a spark of awareness in them now. He saw the cubs. He must have felt their small, warm bodies pressed against him, smelled their innocent scent. There was no aggression in his gaze, no sign of threat. Instead, there was a profound stillness, as if he were trying to comprehend this strange congregation. The cubs, perhaps sensing the subtle shift in his state, redoubled their unconscious efforts. One continued to lick at his face, its tiny tongue working around his muzzle. Another nudged his shoulder persistently. It wasn't a coordinated rescue attempt in any human sense, but their sustained presence, their body heat, however minimal, against the cooling evening air that was beginning to set in, their persistent, gentle stimuli. These things were undeniably having an effect. It was as if their innocent vitality was a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The shadows lengthened, and a chill began to creep into the air. This was the critical period. If the lion couldn't regain his feet before full darkness, the hyenas, emboldened by the night, would surely overwhelm him and the cubs. David watched, his heart pounding, torn between his duty to observe and the overwhelming desire to intervene. He made a calculated decision. Starting his vehicle, he slowly drove it in a wide arc, positioning it several hundred yards away, but in a location that might subtly discourage the hyenas from approaching too closely from one direction, using the bulk of the Land Rover as a passive deterrent without directly alarming the lions. He returned his focus to the scene. The lion was trying to move. A deep, guttural groan escaped him, a sound of pure, agonizing effort. His massive head lifted an inch, then fell back. The cubs drew back slightly, startled by the sound and movement, but they didn't flee. They watched, their small heads cocked. He tried again. This time, his forelegs scrabbled at the muddy ground, seeking purchase. His shoulder muscles bunched, cording with the strain. He was drawing on reserves of strength that David wouldn't have believed he still possessed. The cubs seemed to sense the shift, the surge of effort. One of them let out an encouraging yelp, a sound that was almost like a bark. The air was electric with tension. The savanna held its breath. Dust motes danced in the fading shafts of sunlight. The scent of damp earth, wild sage, and the faint, coppery tang of blood hung heavy. The lion's ragged breaths were harsh gasps in the stillness, each one a victory. The cubs remained close, a small, fuzzy audience to this monumental struggle, their presence an unspoken encouragement. With a tremendous, shuddering effort that seemed to draw from the very core of his being, the lion pushed. His hindquarters, hampered by the injured leg, dragged uselessly for a moment. Then, somehow, he found leverage. He was on his forelegs, his great head hanging low, his body trembling violently. He paused, gathering himself, his breath rasping. The cubs watched, silent now, their eyes wide. One of them, the boldest, reached out a tentative paw and touched his bloodied flank, a feather-like contact. He tried to rise further, to bring his hindquarters under him. He slipped, his good rear leg skidding in the mud, and he nearly went down again, a pained grunt torn from him. But he held. He held, his muscles quivering, his body a testament to raw, indomitable will. The cubs huddled closer now, as if trying to offer their minuscule support. David found himself whispering, "Come on, old man. Come on." And then, with a final, convulsive heave, he was up. Unsteady, swaying, his injured leg held off the ground, but he was standing. A collective sigh seemed to escape the watchers, both human and animal. The vultures in the trees shifted uneasily. The distant hyenas paused in their pacing. The king, battered and broken, was on his feet. He stood there for a long moment, his sides heaving, his head low. Then, slowly, he turned his massive head and looked at the cubs clustered around his legs. His gaze was no longer dull. It was infused with a weary understanding. He lowered his head further and gently, so gently, nudged the nearest cub with his broad muzzle. It was a clear, unmistakable acknowledgement, a gesture of improbable tenderness from a creature forged in the crucible of survival. The cub responded by rubbing its head against his scarred cheek. He took a shaky step, then another. The cubs followed, pressing close to his sides, a tiny, devoted entourage. He was alive, against all odds. He let out a low, rumbling sound, not quite a roar, but a deep, resonant vibration that spoke of enduring power. It was the sound of defiance, of life stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. David watched, a profound sense of awe washing over him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that without the cubs, the lion would have succumbed. Their innocent persistence, their warmth, their unwavering presence had been the tipping point. He made a quick call to the veterinary unit, not for immediate intervention now that the lion was mobile, but for a follow-up, to monitor his recovery. The big male was far from safe. His injuries were severe, and infection was a serious risk. But he had a fighting chance, a chance gifted to him by the most unlikely of saviors. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the plains in a deep, velvety twilight, the small, improbable group moved slowly towards the shelter of a dense thicket. The massive, limping lion, flanked by his tiny, spotted guardians, disappeared into the gathering glow. David remained for a long while, the image seared into his mind. He had witnessed something primal, something that transcended the usual narratives of predation and competition. It was a moment of pure, unscripted grace. The old lion eventually found a relatively dry patch of earth beneath the interwoven branches of the thicket. He lowered himself carefully, a groan escaping him as his injured leg protested. Instantly, the cubs pressed against his battered frame, burrowing into his warmth, a small, living constellation of comfort against the vast, cooling plains. The storm had passed, its fury spent. Now, a different kind of quiet, one filled with fragile hope and the soft sounds of contented breathing, settled over this small corner of the savannah. The story of the fallen king and the cubs who had stayed by his side, who had nudged and licked and simply been there until he found the strength to rise, was already beginning to etch itself into the living memory of the land, a testament to the surprising, resilient, and often hidden threads of connection that bind all creatures, great and small. And in the days and weeks that followed, as the old lion slowly, miraculously recovered, with the vigilant, distant support of David and the veterinary team, the tale of the cubs' vigil became a quiet legend within the reserve. Rangers would point to the distant thicket, their voices hushed with reverence, sharing the story of how the smallest of beings, in their innocent persistence, had helped save one of the savannah's greatest. It served as a profound reminder that courage and compassion could bloom in the most unexpected places, under the most challenging skies. The silence that had followed the storm had indeed been broken, not by cries of despair, but by the soft, persistent heartbeats of an unlikely alliance, an echo of kindness that resonated long after the thunder had faded.